Riverside Police, what's your emergency?
I think I found a dead body.
Sorry?
Dead body.
There's a dead body?
Yeah.
So someone slipped in and drowned, or actually, is this a murder scene?
It looks like it's a teenager, really.
Looks like a teenager.
Why was a young man's life taken in such a tragic way?
There's something dark going on underneath that relationship.
It's about status, power, control.
It's reckless and it's intentional.
We have a 2-hour time period when we don't know where they've been and what they've done. Is there a killer on the loose? We need the evidence to tell us.
A dog walker going along the banks of the River Hull spotted something which looked to them suspicious.
Can you tell if it's a male or a female?
Male, I think.
When they took a closer look, they could see that it was the body just on the edge of the riverbank.
And you say you've actually touched him and there was no response?
I took him in my foot.
It's obviously a young person, probably aged between 16 and 20.
There's no chance that he's asleep or anything, there's no breathing or anything like that I could see.
No.
Police cordon off a stretch of the River Hull. It's not yet clear how the teenager died.
The body isn't fully submerged, the head is slightly, but the majority of the body is just lying on the riverbank.
Supposed to a passerby, it may have appeared as if this is somebody who had got into difficulties in the river itself.
No obvious signs of murder. No visible signs of a struggle or stab wounds or anything like that. A whole number of options come to mind, but you must go with what the forensics tell you.
You always have to treat any scene where a body is as a suspicious scene. Is the death natural causes? Is it suicide? Has someone fallen in the river? Have they been drunk and fallen in? Or is it murder? The role of a crime scene manager is to rule out the different hypotheses.
A pathologist is called to the scene.
The first thing to do is identify the body. Often, once you know the identity of a body, the rest of it falls into place.
CSIs search the cordon, but find no personal belongings.
The main way that we can identify someone quite quickly is on fingerprints. If someone's known on police record, you only need a small bit of fingerprint to be able to identify who they are.
The teenager's fingerprints are sent off to be run through the database, while police check missing persons reports and call on nearby homes.
There's quite a large housing estate on one side of the riverbank. Your job, as well as to investigate and bring closure for the loved ones, is also to, if you like, reassure the public.
Just hours after finding the man, the fingerprints hit a match. He's identified as Connor Lyons.
He was 17, but probably looked about 15 or 16. He's extremely a popular young lad.
He was a local boy, a local teenager, really at the cusp of adulthood. He was just about to make those big moves, leaving school, starting work. We knew that there would have been a lot of interest in the area from that community because it wasn't really clear how he was there, why he was there.
He's on the fingerprint register, so he's got a criminal conviction. But the criminal conviction is for low-level social crime, so nothing earth-shattering. He's not a career criminal. He's just a young lad that's probably lost his way a little bit. He'd turned a bit of a corner and was more focused on what he wanted to do, and he was going to go to college and learn to be a plumber. So he had a career in mind, a well-paid career as well. He was kind-hearted, and no one had a bad word to say for him.
Connor lives less than a mile from the crime scene.
The police had the awful job of going round to his parents to confirm that they found his body.
It's very difficult to tell the family that their loved one has died in suspicious circumstances, and you haven't come to any conclusions yet, because they want answers. They want to make sense of it.
Connor's family tell them he went out around 8 p.m. He was riding his bike with his loyal companion Callie by his side.
From speaking to family, Connor had a dog called Callie, and his dog literally was by his side day and night, and he had a lead for him. The time that Connor went missing, the dog also goes missing.
Callie was found alone later that night, hungry and nervous, helping narrow down Connor's final movements. CSIs at the river look for clues as to what has happened.
The victim, Connor, was missing a gold bracelet, bike, and his mobile phone.
There was a gold bracelet that had been bought for him as a present. It did raise a suspicion as to whether or not there had been some form of foul play.
The fact that these are missing then tends to point towards, was this a robbery?
Amid the uncertainty, speculation is rife.
This would have caused a ripple effect within the community. Hearing the news of a young person known well within the community, knowing the family within the community, people start talking and people start coming up with their own theories and their own conclusions to what was going on in that situation.
There'll be all sorts of stuff on the rumour mill. It's a two-way street. The public want to know what's going on, but equally the police want to harvest any information or intelligence there is that might help their inquiry. There was a rumour circulating. He was talking about suicidal tendencies.
There was the seed of potentially Connor got into problems with others, potentially involving drugs, and that he may have been harmed by those people.
With rumours swirling, the team urgently needs to determine how Connor died.
If this is murder, how can the crime scene tell us the story as to what has happened?
Is it a suicide? Is it foul play? Lots of question marks at the moment, and no real answers.
The body of 17-year-old aspiring plumber Connor Lyons has been found on the banks of the River Hull.
The reaction in the newsroom was obviously one of sympathy for the people involved, but also you switch into a professional gear. It's a big news story with a lot of interest in the area because he formed part of the community where, sadly, he died. Questions being asked were, how on earth did it happen? Why did it happen? And really, is it a safe place for my children to go?
But after finding no obvious injuries, forensics still need to determine how he died and if anyone else is involved.
Until you've had a post-mortem examination on the body, you don't really know what you're looking for. You have to set your parameters quite large. There's a lot of mud around. I would expect that the suspects would be covered in mud, or at least have mud on their lower clothing, their footwear, and their bottoms of their trousers. Soil samples are a really important sample to take from these kind of crime scenes because they may link back to an offender. If you find a pair of shoes or clothing with soil on them, you can match that. Soil can be really distinctive to a particular area. The soil samples will be taken from multiple areas around where the body's been found. You're not looking at a really deep soil sample because if there's any transfer of material, it's going to be the top surface.
They also focus on finding Connor's missing phone, bike, and a gold bracelet he was wearing.
There is a possible motive of robbery.
If someone's been found on a riverbank, there may be items that have been thrown into the river close to where that body is, or items might have fallen off the body.
Police divers enter the water.
Searching a riverbed in the UK is very difficult. It's a long, laborious process. The visibility in the water is virtually zero, and so the police divers would be doing a fingertip search. It's a scientific process to try and determine how wide an area they need to search. Depending on how fast the river's flowing and how strong the current is, that could wash away evidence. It could move evidence.
With rumours flying around about how Connor died, they need to know more about his life.
Straight away, the police have got to do an intelligence search to find out what they know about Connor and who his known associates are, because that may well point to foul play. There's clearly evidence that Connor was a very popular, nice young man.
Connor moved to the Bransholme estate in Hull 3 years ago.
The Bransholme estate sits on the outskirts of the city to the east of the River Hull. The estate was built in the 1960s and 70s, and at the time it was described as the biggest council estate in Europe. But despite its size, I would say it still retains a village feel. It had its own shops, had its own pubs, had its own churches, schools. And there is a strong community identity. It tends to be very much a case of everybody really knows everybody else. Connor was a very well-known character on the Bransholme estate. We quickly became aware of his popularity through social media.
Shocked by his death, Connor's devastated friends post tributes to him on social media, and flowers from the community build at the crime scene.
The support Connor's family gave to each other and from the community was a lot of sympathy as well, losing somebody so young.
He turned his life around from having difficulties. He'd had a nasty accident a couple of years beforehand.
Police discover that Connor was badly injured in a serious bike accident.
Somebody's going through a traumatic experience. Their vulnerabilities are going to be heightened. That accident had a significant impact on his body and would have had a significant impact on his mental health. And through that traumatic experience, we've seen a decline and a change in Connor's behaviour. And what we start to see is a trajectory of change, getting involved in things that they shouldn't.
They've shut down all the youth clubs and there's nothing for kids to do.
Boredom amongst young people is an interesting factor. We're talking about economic climates and we're talking about lack of opportunity. We're talking about lack of resources that unfortunately sometimes get them caught up in the law.
Connor's family tell police he's been putting the past behind him, but in recent weeks, he hadn't been his usual self.
Connor was distracted. That could indicate he was having some difficulties with friends. It's important to speak to their peer group to find out what they were interested in, who their friends were, because normally, if someone's murdered, they will be known to the perpetrator.
To build up a picture of who was in Connor's life, detectives take statements from his associates and study their social media, and quickly have a lead.
There was a social media post in relation to the sale of Connor's missing bike.
Connor had a quite distinctive bicycle that he took everywhere. Everyone knew what it looked like.
Digital experts trace the seller.
Comes back to a guy called Cole Jarvis.
Jarvis lived on the Bransholme estate in the same area as Connor. They were, in fact, living quite close to each other.
He was somebody who had a group of friends, many of whom were significantly younger than he was. Connor was one of them.
Police learn Connor met 21-year-old Jarvis around 6 months ago, after approaching him for help fixing up a dirt bike.
Young people make relationships quite quickly. Both of them like bikes, both of them like motorcycles, and it's those things that may have that initial connection.
They're members of the same peer group, and it would seem that the common interest they had is playing video games, lamping, which is hunting for things like rabbits and stuff like that.
Digital forensic investigators find Jarvis has made several attempts to sell Connor's bike on social media.
On the face of it, it's evidence of suspicion of theft. So let's get him in, hear what he has to say. And it's very important in a murder investigation, you get a story from a suspect as quickly as you can, so that you can either corroborate it or otherwise.
Cole Jarvis is arrested on suspicion of theft.
He said, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't got the bike. And says, I don't know Connor that well at all. He's, moved in beside me and we're acquaintances more than friends. It's when the police start delving into the peer group and what they've witnessed and what they've heard from Jarvis, they realise that Jarvis is telling a pack of lies.
With Jarvis in custody, an associate gives a statement. He saw Jarvis after 11 p.m. wearing wet and muddy trainers, riding Connor's distinctive bike.
One of the peer group says that he had squelchy shoes, which indicates he's been near water. His explanation for that was, because I'd taken the dog out for a walk. What is damning for him, he was seen riding that bike on the evening.
When confronted, Jarvis's account takes a U-turn.
He then changes his tune, and he tries to change the narrative in another direction.
Now Jarvis tells police he and Connor are in fact friends, and he did have his bike because Connor sold it to him.
Of all the items that went missing, this was in many senses, one of the more important ones, if not the most important, because it was a bike that was important to Connor, and would have been unlikely that he would have been trying to sell it.
What we see with Jarvis, he's continued to go out into the community and try and sell the bike. It suggests that he may be involved.
Why else did he sell the bike? Because he knows Connor won't need it because he's dead. That's my conjecture.
Detectives asked Jarvis if he went to the riverbank on the night of the 18th of January. He denies ever being there.
Now, it's not an offence to tell a lie to a police officer, but what it is good circumstantial evidence if you can prove that that suspect has lied to you, that his account or his narrative can't be relied upon because all these witnesses say this is actually what happened.
Intelligence officers scrutinising the rumours spreading across the estate about how Connor died have found further evidence that Jarvis has been lying.
When the police start questioning the peer group, they suddenly starts to dawn on them that the one starting these rumours is actually Jarvis. And why is he doing it?
One involved the suggestion that he had been with Connor much earlier in the evening, when Connor had described wanting to hurt or kill himself. He also, to another friend, raised the possibility of Connor being looked for by people involved with drugs. There wasn't one clear picture.
None of which was true, of course. He's sowing a seed of disinformation, if you like, to go along with his narrative.
And in a sense, that implicated his role in this.
We're starting to get a bit more of a picture about a possible suspect, or certainly a person of interest. Doesn't say he's a murderer, but he's got questions to answer.
Needing to know more about Jarvis, detectives interrogate his digital footprint. He claims to have lost his phone, so they request his records from the network. Meanwhile, forensic search teams have recovered Connor's bike from inside a relative's shed.
The problem with a bike is that it's free for other people to touch and handle. Jarvis was actually known to the victim. He had legitimate access to the bike, so finding their DNA and fingerprints on there isn't really going to take the case that much further forward.
The team still needs forensics to tell them what happened to Connor on the riverbank.
You have to prove the cause of death. And the only person that can say that person died as a direct result of that action is a pathologist. They're the forensic experts.
The day after Connor was found, the results are in.
The cause of death wasn't straightforward. The initial indication was that Connor had died by drowning, which remained the case. That is how he died. But as the post-mortem was carried out and took place, there were other findings as well. There was damage and bruising around the neck area, which indicated a ligature may have been used. He also had petechiae, so that's the little blood vessels around your eyes and inside your lip, which can rupture on pressure being applied to the neck. Those injuries were not immediately apparent on the surface.
One possible scenario that the pathologist came up with was that Connor had been strangled and then left to drown. So he'd been left in the water knowing that he was going to drown because he'd been rendered unconscious. The second possible scenario was that he'd been strangled and then held forcibly under the water to drown.
Whichever way, The strangulation was an integral part to his death.
Were they callous enough just to leave him there to die? It matters not. In law, there is no difference.
Humberside police officially have a murder investigation on their hands.
Now this is a murder inquiry. There's a massive shift in the investigation. What was used to strangle Connor? It's really important to try and find the ligature. Being able to find that vital piece of evidence may lead them to the offenders because they might well have their DNA as well as the victim's DNA.
The pathologist suggests that Connor may have been strangled with a rope over his waterproof jacket, which would explain why there are no visible markings on his skin.
A piece of rope had some significance because one of the witnesses had described Jarvis as making a reference to a piece of blue rope in the context of using it to tie people up.
Maybe Jarvis showing people the blue rope is just him showing what he's prepared to do.
This time, when police ask Jarvis about Connor's death, he answers no comment.
It can be tremendously frustrating because they can't really get to the root of the murder. There's lots of circumstantial evidence pointing to him as a person of interest, and he can't be eliminated, but he's implicated, but there is insufficient evidence to charge him with murder.
The team needs more time to find a forensic link between him and the crime scene.
There's a sense of urgency now. They haven't got an open-ended clock. What you have to do is prove the lies and prove the truth.
Police in Humberside are running out of time to question 21-year-old Cole Jarvis about the murder of his friend, 17-year-old Connor Lyons. A post-mortem has found that Connor was strangled before drowning in the River Hull, and circumstantial evidence points to Jarvis as his killer. But the team still needs a direct forensic link between him and the crime scene.
There's loads of circumstantial evidence, but there's nothing to put both of them at the murder scene.
There's very little evidence at that crime scene, so you have to then look at further types of evidence, so digital evidence, CCTV evidence.
The clock is ticking all this time. You've got to be resilient. You've got to keep pushing away.
Hull Magistrates Court grants the team a 36-hour custody extension. Using CCTV and phone data, police track Connor and Jarvis's movements. The pathologist determines Connor lay dead for several hours before he was discovered.
Time of death is crucial for forming the parameters of harvesting CCTV. So instead of doing a wide sweep, almost a fishing expedition, you've got time parameters that you can go to. Unfortunately, there's no CCTV of the actual murder scene, but you can look at when was the suspect and the victim last seen, were they seen together.
After leaving home, Connor meets up with Jarvis and they're seen out on the estate together. At around 8 p.m, CCTV captures two figures walking towards the crime scene.
The closest point to the river from the estate is only a 5-10 minute walk.
You were able to see a dog there which matched by description Connor's dog. It was not possible from the footage itself to necessarily make very clear identifications. A lot of time was spent analysing different pieces of CCTV footage to piece them together. You were able to see parts of the clothing which police were able to match up with some of the clothing that we know either Connor or Jarvis were wearing on the night.
The figure that was identified was wearing like a green Parker-style jacket, but they had very distinctive trainers, which covered reflective area that the CCTV picks up.
When you put them all together, you can start to say, well, this must be Connor, this must be Jarvis.
In this case, it indicates Connor would have gone there of his own volition, and we know that Connor and some of his friends were into lamping, which is basically hunting wildlife at night. And it may well be perfectly legitimate for him to go to that area by the riverbank late at night to do some lamping. And I suggest that's how he was lured to that area.
Officers continue to track the men on CCTV. Meanwhile, digital experts analysing phone data have discovered that Jarvis has been telling more lies about his friendship with Connor.
The data indicated that there were quite abusive text messages, that the relationship was deteriorating.
The relationship between Connor and Jarvis was a volatile one, which was capable of erupting into violence at times. The overall picture we had was that Jarvis appeared on the evidence to be the dominant person within that dynamic.
Jarvis is slightly older than the peer group he's mixing with, and I think people can draw the conclusion that he was a bit of a bully, that he tried to coerce younger kids into doing what he wanted them to do. My conjecture would be that he mixed with younger boys because he liked to be in control. He liked to be the boss, if you like.
He's going to have a little bit more knowledge as opposed to those young people that he may engage in. So it's almost like currency. Status, hierarchy, and control play a role in friendships. In every group and in every friendship group, there is going to be individuals that want to take lead, that want to be drivers. Jarvis being the leader of the pack in that type of environment, it would have definitely stroked his ego. Where Connor was slightly different is that he was an individual with a strong personality, and we know of loads of incidents where they clashed.
The team needs to find out if one of their fights turned fatal, and why. Shortly after 8 p.m, the figures are captured again on CCTV crossing John Newton Way, heading towards the River Hull, before they disappear from view. At 10:20 p.m, only one figure reappears.
Connor is not in that CCTV. There's a gap of 2 hours, which is consistent with what the pathologist says at the time of death. You can conclude that Connor's either dead or dying by the side of the river.
Detectives are convinced the grainy figure on CCTV is Jarvis fleeing the crime scene. He's seen heading back towards his home, but they still need further proof it's him. With the custody clock running out, a new key witness comes forward with incriminating evidence, just in time.
There was an eyewitness who was driving along Thomas Clarkson Way on his way to work at around 10:20. He's driven past. He's seen this person with a dog.
The area off Thomas Clarkson Way towards the river is pretty much open countryside, woodland, if you like. No CCTV, no street lighting. Large areas that isn't covered by any lighting at all. It's quite a desolate spot. There isn't any reason, good reason perhaps, to be in that area on foot at that time of night.
He was able to give a description of a man wearing broadly similar clothing which was worn by Jarvis that night and was with a dog that matched the description of Connor's. The eyewitness was able to pick out Jarvis on an identification parade, albeit he could not be sure. It fits the next sighting of the defendant on CCTV heading back towards his home area, only minutes from that sighting. It was one of the most remarkable pieces of evidence in the sense of I have no idea how he remembered seeing this person and the timing. It was quite extraordinary.
Investigators cross-reference the CCTV and eyewitness testimony with Jarvis's phone data.
At various stages on the CCTV footage, you could see that the person was using the telephone.
When they match the data, he's trying to sell the bicycle on the mobile phone. Now, that's very callous.
Humberside police arrest Cole Jarvis on suspicion of Connor's murder. A warrant is secured to search his home and related addresses.
There's certain things in an investigation that you would want to look for. In this case, you'd be definitely looking for any muddy clothing, any muddy shoes, because potentially you can tie that muddy clothing up to the riverbank where Connor was last seen alive. If an item's really muddy or really wet, the DNA may be inhibited because of the contamination. The bacteria may be from the mud and also from the wet. Say if it's been in water, a river or something. These shoes are quite heavily mud stained. They've got quite a lot of soil on the tops, on the uppers and the lowers of them. The forensic scientists might be able to ascertain where the soil has come from, and if they've got a soil sample from a site, they can compare the two and see if this soil from the shoe has been at the scene.
The trainers and mud samples collected at the crime scene are sent for comparison to soil expert Dr. Rosie Everett.
My role on the case is to understand whether there is any forensic ecological evidence that can help the police understand whether the suspect has been at the scene. The key pieces of evidence that I examined was a pair of trainers. They were caked in mud right up to the laces. We want to understand what is that mud, where has it come from, and whether there's anything microscopic that we can use to link the scene and the suspect.
Back at HQ, the intelligence team are still trying to understand what triggered Jarvis to kill Connor.
When you looked at the relationship between them and looked at the communications between them, what it did show is a volatile relationship where they were capable of issuing threats to each other, at times fighting like cat and dog.
The team discovers that 3 months ago, tensions boiled over after Jarvis sold a bike belonging to Connor without his permission.
Connor confronts him and says, "Where's my money for my bike?" And Jarvis refuses to give it to him. So at that stage, I would suggest it's when it really starts to turn toxic, because he's basically stealing from Connor for whatever reason.
There were messages in which it appeared Connor was making quite significant threats towards Jarvis. What was also apparent is that when you look at the messages, Jarvis had no fear of Connor. And you had messages from Jarvis to Connor saying, "Carry on testing me, you'll see what would happen."
There were text messages where Jarvis says that Connor is a cheeky, gobby little rat.
I think that maybe his power was challenged. I think that he felt that control he was losing because he's seen in Connor that he's an individual that didn't want to toe the line anymore. But when you have another individual that then stands out from the pack and says, "No, I don't like this. No, I'm not going to follow your instruction," and actually meet you at some point with conflict, it changes the whole dynamic. And then when it changes that whole dynamic, then someone like Jarvis now has to demonstrate authority, now has to demonstrate control.
A witness tells police Jarvis showed them a video of him whacking Connor on the leg with a boat paddle, causing Connor to cry while he laughed.
Jarvis was older and he was more well-developed. There would also be a physical imbalance.
There is evidence that he's stolen from Connor in the past. There is evidence of Jarvis's propensity to use violence and to be forceful in forcing Connor to do what he wanted him to do. If you put it all together, it's starting to show Jarvis's propensity for violence, and the violence is against Connor, who's younger and weaker. It shows some intent.
With the theft of Connor's bike the possible motive, searchers at Jarvis's home move into the garden.
Clearly, you're looking for a murder weapon.
A piece of blue rope was recovered, secreted or hidden in a garden area.
Intelligence has revealed that the offender's been boasting about using a rope to injure somebody. Is this the same rope? You have to kind of put your mind in the mindset of the person doing the attack and think, if I was going to strangle someone with a rope, how would I do it? And therefore that makes it easier for us to then target specific areas on an item for DNA transfer. The ends of the rope might have the offender's DNA on, and then the center of the rope might have the victim's DNA on. The trouble with this is it's got mud on it, and also it's been wet, so it might inhibit any DNA. So you need to try and avoid the areas of mud, which on something like this is quite difficult. Really get the swab into the nooks and crannies of the rope.
DNA samples from the rope are sent for profiling.
That rope was found to have the DNA of both Connor and Jarvis on, but in locations which would have been consistent with it being held as a ligature and potentially used on Connor.
A rope really is intimate, it's really close, and he would have seen and heard every emotion that would have came with it. So that level of violence really stands out.
That is evidence, good forensic evidence. If there's a rational or lawful explanation for that, don't you think he should have given it? Quite damning, I would say. And it's becoming quite a compelling case for the prosecution.
Cole Jarvis is charged with Connor's murder.
But it doesn't stop there. The police, up to the day of the trial, are still investigating and still asking questions, because he could come up with a cock and bull story saying, well, I've touched the rope, and so has Connor, because we're friends.
With Jarvis changing his story at every turn, police can't afford to leave a jury in any doubt. They still need to forensically link him to the crime scene.
If we don't get that crucial evidence at that scene, we potentially might lose the case at court. The initial thoughts are there's not much at that crime scene.
But after examining Jarvis's trainers, Dr. Rosie Everett has made a breakthrough.
My particular field is an area called diatoms, microscopic single-celled algae. So nothing you can see with the naked eye, but a piece of evidence that forms in water and soils. The suspect was very clear that they'd never been to that part of the River Hull. Actually, this evidence proves that they have.
It was a light bulb moment in the course of the investigation.
"21-year-old Cole Jarvis has been charged with murder. A rope recovered from his garden has returned a DNA match to 17-year-old Connor Lyons, consistent with the pathologist's findings that he was strangled before drowning in the River Hull. And now, microscopic forensic evidence has tied him to the crime scene.
Part of the reason that diatoms have become such an interest as a forensic evidence type is that if they come in contact with clothing, they get into the fibres and they lodge themselves between your fibres. And it's the same with footwear as well. We can look at them down the microscope to identify them to species level based on their shape, based on their size, and based on the features that they have as part of their structure.
Diatoms are unique to particular habitats.
So there are diatoms that are specific to the sea, there are diatoms that are specific to different river types, and there are different diatoms that grow within soils. So we can use that information to build a picture of where they've come from. The River Hull is a really interesting environment from a diatom perspective. It's a big estuary system. So the fresh water runs into the Humber estuary, which then obviously runs out into the North Sea. And it's a huge tidal system. And it means that you have quite a distinct diatom population from all three of those environments. What we can do, if an item of clothing or footwear has those diatoms on them, then we can try and make a link between, for example, a suspect and a scene.
Samples from Jarvis's trainers are compared to mud and water from the crime scene.
So when you're examining a piece of evidence, we have to be able to demonstrate, if there are diatoms in that evidence, that it's not just a quick contact, that it's across the shoe. In total, there were 6 samples. So one from the sole, one from the toe cap, one from the rear of the trainer, and then 3 systematically moving up the laces. Looking at the trainers under the microscope, they were covered in diatoms. This demonstrated that this shoe had been absolutely caked up to the laces in wet mud and had come in contact with all of these different diatom populations. And these diatoms matched exactly to the scene.
It's crucial because it directly points to Jarvis being at the murder scene, i.e. on the riverbank where Connor's body was found. It actually links him, the first bit of evidence actually links him physically to that riverbank.
8 months on from Connor's murder, Cole Jarvis's trial begins.
The atmosphere in any case where somebody has died is always tense and intense. And the whole range of emotions, from anger to frustration to anxiety to worry to fear floating around the courtroom.
In a close-knit community like Bransholm, it's always very, very sad that a case like this can divide and split friendships.
It does add to the pressure. And it's those emotions that are there we also have to try to shield the jury from, because emotion isn't part of their decision-making.
In court, Jarvis showed a lack of remorse.
He was straight-faced, just stared at the wall, was totally disinterested in the proceedings.
He thought he was going to get away with it.
Jarvis's defense claim he has nothing at all to do with Connor's murder.
This case has got really good, compelling forensic evidence. You've got diatoms that have been found on the shoes and the clothing that was found in the river. You've got Connor's DNA on the rope. And also you've got CCTV that puts the victim with the offender at a certain time. All those 3 bits of compelling forensic evidence corroborate with each other. So you've got evidence that will link to other evidence to create a really compelling picture.
The only people that know what actually happened on the riverbank is Connor, who's dead, and Jarvis, who's made no comment. Now, if he had an explanation, it would have been in his interest to give it, but he never did.
After hearing the evidence for 3 weeks, it takes under 5 hours for the jury to come to a verdict. Jarvis is found guilty.
When the guilty verdict was announced in court, there were gasps from the public gallery. There was also a lot of tears, and emotions were running high. And it spilled out after the court into words, shouts, screams between the 2 sides on the courtroom steps outside.
Jarvis is sentenced to a minimum term of 21 years.
The judge, in his summing up, alludes to the fact that he believed that Jarvis lured Connor to the riverbank, probably saying, let's go lamping, which was popular with them both. He's gone there and the intention was to rob him of his gold bracelet and his bicycle. But ultimately, we don't know what was in Jarvis's mind because he's never told anybody. He was invited to, but he never did. He never gave evidence in his own defence. If he'd got away with this, I think he would have escalated his offending.
When we think about toxic relationships in any form, people may ask the question, why does a person stay? But oftentimes there may have been elements where they did have, connection. There may have been elements within their relationship where they had a bit of a laugh.
This is very sad. Connor was loved and respected by all. That's, replicated in the number of people that turned out at his funeral. There were hundreds of people there.
Amid COVID restrictions, 300 vehicles drive in convoy in his honour.
The memory of Connor is one that is beautiful, one that is inspirational, one that shows change.
He had plans for the future, and who knows where that have led. Sadly, we'll never know, because his life was taken from him before he could realise his ambitions.
for a long time. I was very angry. I'm not a cop. I'm not a coroner. I'm not the DA. But I had to actually step into their role and do their job. Didn't even want to look into it. It's almost as though she wasn't even a person. I had no idea what I was getting into. And I really went into this absolutely naive. It's been a never-ending saw blade of witnesses, documents, and searching for answers and the truth behind my mother's murder. I did what needed to be done. If I wouldn't have done it, nobody would have done it. This bus has a name. Her name is Sissy Hankshaw. From the book, Even Cowgirls Get the Blues. I love the peace signs that we get driving down the road. There are certain things that make me happy, keep me light, remind me to get out of my head, because you have to live life. My name is Lisa Coppell, and I live in Arvada, Colorado. My mother was born Carmina Coppell in Oakland, California, August 14th of 1930, to a well-to-do family in Berkeley. My mom was always searching for love and never quite found the right love. My mom had several different marriages, resulting in a total of 7 of us children. But eventually it was just my mom, my sister, Paula, and myself. In 1970, Mom moved an 8-foot wide by 24-foot long mobile home up to Stratton Park, Colorado. Where we lived was very rural, very rustic. We had no indoor plumbing and virtually off-grid. In 1972, Mom noticed a pickup truck across the field and spotted a man named Chuck, Charles Leroy Anderson. Mom and Chuck had a whirlwind romance. And on February 12th of 1973, they went and got married. They were only married 9 days, but Chuck was a bad influence on Mom. They drank a lot during the week, weekends. It didn't matter. February 21st of 1973. Mom and Chuck had been at the bar drinking, and they came home pretty drunk. I laid in my bunk and listened to them fight. And I remember him yelling at her, "Look at what you made me do," and screaming at her, calling her dirty and nasty names. And then I went to sleep because it got quiet. Well, a little while later, I'm awakened by one of the neighbors shaking me gently, saying, "Girls, you have to get up. Something's happened, and you need to get dressed, and we need to go." I was guided down the hallway where I had to step over a sheet that was my mom's legs. I knew what death was, but I didn't quite register the darkness that I'd just experienced. We were put into an emergency vehicle, an ambulance. I was 10 years old, so I couldn't really process what was going on. I'm up in between the driver and Chuck asking, what happened to my mom? What happened to my mom? Will somebody tell me what happened to my mom? And they wouldn't answer me. I overheard them call in that there was a 42-year-old woman, Caucasian, with a gunshot wound to her head. Chuck had suffered a bullet wound to his hand. Chuck's explanation of what happened was they were showing the gun to each other, and my mother, she got startled and flipped it in the air and caught it with her thumb, and it just went off in her forehead. When we got to the hospital, we're unloaded, and Chuck is taken into an emergency area, and my sister Paula and I were set on a gurney and told to be big girls about this. They said, your mom has died, and asked if we had any living relatives around that we could contact. Chuck and I didn't speak until the funeral. And he insisted that he didn't kill my mom, it was just an accident. But I couldn't stop thinking about all of the nasty things that I heard him say. It left a lot of doubt and questions. I remember not being happy with certain answers that I was given. Even though the 10-year-old Lisa saw and knew what she knew, the police didn't really talk to me. My mom's death was ruled an accident, and it was case closed. My mom's belongings were put in probate, along with the livestock from our land. Apparently, Chuck was the one who bought my horses. We became orphans and wards of the court. My sister and I both were in the foster care system, going through foster homes. It was a very hard transition, and that's how we started the next part of our lives.
Remember, people used to say, why do you hang out with her? She gets so crazy and angry. And I said, well, she has reason to be angry. Imagine if your life was the way that hers was.
Foster homes and group homes and being flipped around to here to there. And
sleeping in your car, sleeping in the park. I remember when you started looking for your family.
In 1994, I was trying to find family. I wanted to know where I came from, and I made contact with the father listed on my birth certificate, and he wrote me a 15-page letter telling me the details of his relationship with my mom. At the end of his 15-page letter, he had written something to the effect of, am I sure that my mom died the way I think she did? And I started questioning, do I really know? I remembered being asleep in the bed with the covers over my head and listening to them argue and them fight. I don't recall all of the details of what happened that night, but I do remember Chuck screaming at Mom, telling her, see what you made me do. Look what you made me do. Calling her a bitch. I wanted to find out what the police report had to say about how my mom died. I'm not a trained detective. I'm not a PI by trade, but I'm kind of like a pit bull. Once I get on it and I latch onto it, I'll hang on until the bitter end. True. And I find all of what I'm after. The end of his 15-page letter sparked something in me. I needed to find out the truth to what happened to my mom. I started by getting the police report. It was a 3-inch thick file with tape on it, red tape, case closed tape. And they cut the tape right there in front of me and took the police report out, and they made me my copies. I had to take several days to read it through the first time to start making notes. So this is the first version that Chuck gave regarding how my mom died. How does this make sense to an officer? Somebody that knows firearms doesn't make sense. In the police report, there were 3 versions of what Chuck told the police. In the first one, she was drunk. So he had to take the gun away from her, and he had grabbed the barrel of the gun, and the gun went off accidentally. In the second version, she got startled and dropped the gun, and it just went off from the floor to her forehead. And then the third explanation was that he had to go to the bathroom and went outside. And when he came back in, she was posed with the gun in her hand. And Chuck alluded to my mother committing suicide. I was at my wit's end and felt I had no direction to go. It disgusted me to know that Chuck was living his best life in the bars with no accountability. I tried to block it out, but Fort Collins was a small town. There were a couple of times where our paths would cross, and I chose to look the other way. I chose a different avenue. I thought maybe I should go ahead and do some actual investigation. And so I began contacting people. I broke down a list of witnesses, sheriffs, DAs, and I set forth to contact almost everybody on those lists. I started with the coroners. One of the people I contacted was Dr. Agura, and he was very engaging and said he remembered my mom's case. He said that he remembered having to do a second autopsy on my mom. There was disagreement on the angle of the gun and whether or not it was her hand on the gun at the time it was fired. And he said the second autopsy was a considerable difference in opinion from the first autopsy. The angle of the first autopsy was not even plausible with Charlie's versions of the story. He was adamant that the first one had been botched. But a panel of 6 professionals decided that the differences in angles wasn't something that needed additional investigation. They were going to rule Mom's death as an accident, case closed, and they thought everything was done until I came around asking questions. I wanted to know what was in that second autopsy. So I called the coroner's office and I asked for them to take a look at this file again. They couldn't even find the file. There was nothing. It was referenced to a miscellaneous file, but the file was empty and had been for years. And it felt like they just covered it up. There was no headway there. After the coroner's office, I stopped at Old Chicago and thought, you know, I'm gonna have a drink, and it's a bartender's job to listen to my woes. I was just pissed. You know, I left the coroner's office and they don't show any records, you know. Oh, well, we don't even show we did this case.
My name is Diane Fairman. In 1995, I was bartending and Lisa came into the bar and sat down kind of at the end of the bar and just seemed a little distraught and upset.
I began to tell her a brief rundown of my mom's homicide. I needed to find the truth and the answers.
Sometimes people come into bars and they have tall tales. There was just something about you. I just listened and got more and more intrigued, and then when you said it was all in Larimer County, I'm like, oh.
Well, guess what?
I said, well, strangely enough, I just happen to know the person you need to talk to because I'm interning at the coroner's office in Larimer County.
Here I am, looking to get some questions answered, and here she's an intern at the coroner's office. I couldn't believe it. Look at it how you will. I have no doubt that Mom sent me to Old Chicago that day.
I went back and I just said, her story sounds very plausible, and I don't see, even as an intern, that this case doesn't deserve a second look. It just doesn't sound like it could have happened, you know, the way they're saying it happened. I realized who she needed to talk to. It would be the Chief Deputy Coroner of Larimer County. When I went back to the office, I told him that I had met this woman, and she seemed very compelling and very honest and had some interesting facts to tell him, and that he needed to listen to her. And he did.
The Larimer County coroner called me back and said that they found the documents, which included the second autopsy. I was hoping maybe the second autopsy would have the truth and the answers. Lo and behold, it changed everything. Once they found the second autopsy, I made contact with Fred Rosenberg. Fred Rosenberg was an investigator for the Larimer County Coroner's Office. He compared both autopsies and did a skull diagram showing the bullet path. Fred said that the first autopsy wasn't as accurate as Dr. Agura's. It left a lot of doubt and questions. Fred wanted to go over this with me and asked if I could come in. So I went to Fred Rosenberg's office, where he gave me copies of all notes, all reports. It was very difficult initially to view the death pictures. I was saddened that that's now how I'm gonna remember her. But I needed to step out of the 10-year-old Lisa and step into the investigator Lisa. It's all the same person, but it's two completely different roles. That's the only way I've gotten through this.
Fred took the paperwork and all of his sketches and his analysis, and he took it to Dr. Allen, who was the chief medical examiner at the time. Dr. Allen looked at it and agreed wholeheartedly with Fred that this could not have happened the way the first autopsy says it happened. And it definitely was an investigation that needed new ballistics.
The chief coroner reviewed all of the documents that Fred had showed me. However, they did not have the gun because the sheriff's office purged evidence from their evidence room in 1978. Back then, the case wasn't a homicide. So they sold the gun in a big gun auction. So I set out to find a similar gun. I wanted to know the length of the barrel, the length of the handle with the cylinder, and how big the gun was. I had gone to the local pawn shops and traced an H&R single action 22 revolver, and this is what I got. I had to disprove all of Chuck Anderson's stories. In the beginning, Chuck was saying that the gun went off accidentally. Well, the angle of entry in that second autopsy was above her ear and kind of to the back of her head, which couldn't have happened unless the gun was behind her. So I looked in the mirror and I held the paper gun up, and I'm like, there's no way her hand could have been on the gun with a 6-inch barrel. Her wrist would have been broken. The angle disproved almost all of his versions. The gun falling to the floor, or him taking the gun away from her by the barrel, and it wasn't suicide. Her hand could not have been on the gun at the time it was fired, period. I went in and role-played to prove that Mom's hand could not have been on the gun at that angle. It couldn't be. I showed Dr. Allen, and he agreed with me. Her hand could not have been on the gun without her hand being contorted.
Fred and Dr. Allen and Lisa had, I think, several meetings, and Dr. Allen ultimately had enough evidence in front of him that he was able to say, this isn't an accident.
Within a couple of days, Patrick Allen had signed the death certificate to read suspicious for homicide, which is huge, huge, huge. Nobody gets a death certificate changed. It's terribly hard to get a death certificate changed. Finally, there's acknowledgement that I'm not the only one who believes that he killed her. And it's in writing. It's official. What a feat. What a feat. Now, is the sheriff's office going to work on opening the investigation? When the coroner signed the death certificate, I'm thinking, all right, they'll reopen the investigation, it'll go to trial, and then I'll have justice, and there'll be justice for my mother. Absolutely, I thought that they would see what the coroner saw, but they didn't. When I spoke to the sheriff's investigator, he told me that he had interviewed Chuck Anderson recently and that he believed Chuck's explanation in the original police report. And he told me the case was going to be open but inactive until there's new evidence. He wasn't going to work the file anymore. Another brick wall. I couldn't come in and do it for them, but I could get some more answers on my end. I continued to talk to people. I was up near Horsetooth, and I stopped to buy a lighter. And I go in, and who's standing next to me but Chuck? Counting pennies for a pack of cigarettes.
You hadn't seen him in all those years?
Hadn't seen him. Didn't want to. But there he was, ruining my day. He didn't see me. So I got my lighter and I got in my little minivan and I sat in the parking lot and I shook. Oh my God, did I shake. Did I run him over? What do? Do I follow him? What do? I watched him go into a bar. And so I walked in. I walked right up to him, and then he announces to the bar that I'm his long-lost daughter for haven't seen me for years and this and this. And I said, there's an empty table back there. You and I, back there now. And he came and sat down with me. I listened to his story of where he put my mom's ashes. And I knew it was a lie because Chuck bragged at the bars that he took my mom's ashes and threw them into a garbage pit next to his pig pen. Eventually, I told Chuck I wanted something of my mother's, anything. And so we went back to his house.
Must have been chilling, right?
It was chilling. But I know he's not gonna kill me. I'm too friggin' mean. We sat down and he opened his little file drawer and pulled out the deed to Mom's land. He held on to it like a frickin' trophy. Of course, it had been sold in probate, you know, no value other than that was a piece of paper that was in her purse, and I got it back. And he didn't get to keep the trophy. After seeing the deed to the land, I started questioning if Chuck's motive was a monetary value. I don't know, maybe he wanted to try and get her livestock, her land, and it was all about the money. They weren't together for love, that's for sure. Several people had made mention that Chuck wanted to take a life insurance policy out on her, which started a big fight in the bar, because he wanted to be the beneficiary, and Mom wanted Paula and I to be the beneficiary. They were only married 9 days. So she really got uncomfortable and really regretted marrying him and really wanted out and wanted him to go away, but he would not go. I had Chuck Anderson's motive, but it felt like it didn't matter. We can never hit the DA if the police don't do their portion. That's it. It's as far as we go. I'm questioning, will we ever see whatever justice is? Chuck Anderson took everything from me and took everything from my sister Paula. All the things that Paula endured in her years of placement and my mom's death, it even went as far as Paula committing suicide. She was a very troubled person and saw no other way out. I will always think Chuck's responsible for that. In 2001, I was working for a gun scope company, and somebody made mention that they had seen an article written about my mom's death. And in it, they too alluded to suicide. And that was one of my biggest peeves. So I called the Longmont Daily Times and I asked for them to do a retraction. And I waited 7 months before I just had it. And I went into the Longmont Daily Times and I ran into Dee Dee Corral.
There are certain details that I do remember very well.
Right.
Like you storming into the paper, wanting to...
For me, it was, I'm dialing direct.
It's not uncommon for a newspaper to get people coming in who are unhappy with something, and sometimes there is not much to their claims. And in this case, Lisa was fired up, but she also had all the documentation to support her grievance that the word suicide had been used.
I don't mind doing an article on my mom, just make it factual.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I die, somebody's gonna look at this and say, it was suicide.
I would feel the same way. I went through all the reports and corrected some mistakes made in the coverage. And actually, in looking back at my notes, I noticed there were a number of contradictions in Charles Anderson's statements against what I knew was in the police reports. The story would not be complete without his version. We had to make the effort to try to talk to him.
I remember you were gonna go up there. I said, don't go out there alone.
I didn't have anyone available at the paper that day to go with me, so I got my dad to go with me. When I arrived, we had some concerns about Mr. Anderson. He had stickers on the outside of his door, making sure that everyone knew that he had weapons inside, but we had to make the effort. Mr. Anderson was drinking a beer and watching a show on TV. I think it was The Golden Girls. He invited me in, he was friendly, and he seemed willing to talk. And so I started off by asking him just some questions about the case. Immediately, he began to say things that contradicted what was in the police reports. And finally, at some point, just said, what happened? How did she die? How did she get shot? And that was where he looked up, he looked at me, and he said, well, she didn't shoot herself.
I remember you calling me back. Lisa, you'll never believe it. He said that her hand wasn't on the gun at the time it was fired and that she didn't shoot herself.
It was very chilling to me. It was just very direct. What he was saying to me was that he had shot her. It was, to me, a stunning admission. As soon as I left, I called up the sheriff's office and I said, listen, here's what he said to me, and what's your comment? And the lieutenant said, well, I'm not going to tell you my comment based on what you just said. I'm reopening the case.
It's not appropriate for me to judge maybe what wasn't done in the past. I wasn't around in 1973 as far as police work. But in the 2000s, when it came up again with Dee Dee Corral from the Longmont Times call, I was surprised and maybe a little skeptical at first, you know. Okay, this is the media calling to tell me something. I was intrigued by what Dee Dee had to say because he was making a statement he'd never made before, and that changed everything. Here's the evidence to explain inconsistencies with the story that Nina had pulled the trigger herself. It seemed at the time that he was a bit brazen, and he'd gotten away with it all these years.
He bragged in the bars all these years.
Yeah.
But nobody ever reported it.
Right, right. We had information that might finally make a difference. So we were able to put an investigation together, and I assigned the case to investigator Robert Coleman. And he began to look at the case again with fresh eyes.
My hopes were very high that Bob Coleman was going to be able to do this. So I met with him, and I got his file back up to speed. And I was really, for the first time in years, feeling that I would get justice.
Robert Coleman was pretty renowned as a very good interviewer. He was the best interviewer we had. So the key in this case was for Investigator Coleman to bring Chuck Anderson into the office, into an interview room that we could control, to prove that his story, his narrative wasn't right.
Charlie?
Yeah.
Bob Coleman, how you doing?
Thanks, Bob.
Nice to meet you. This is Ernie Hudson.
Pretty good. God bless the VA.
Because this case had so many different versions, it was important to start broad and narrow down to those facts that were disputed, and ultimately the fact of who had their finger on the trigger.
As soon as I got the door open, walked in, I seen her, and I saw her pulling the trigger.
No kidding.
In the course of the interview, there is a point where Undersheriff Hudson explained it couldn't have occurred in the ways that you had described in the past, and here's the evidence, and here's the evidence.
The gun didn't go off by itself.
No.
You had possession of the gun before she was shot, Charlie. You had possession of the gun.
The detectives told me that Bob Coleman had spent 5 hours interviewing Chuck Anderson. They had put up a whiteboard outside the room, and every time they got him to disprove a version of one of his stories,
I'll get you some more coffee, Charlie.
they would go outside and check it off the whiteboard.
There is only one truth, clearly, and that made the ultimate difference in this case. There was only one truth, and he had to come to it, leading him to a point where he quietly says, "You're right."
What happened that night?
I pulled the trigger, but it was like I was helping her commit suicide. That's what it felt like to me.
Why did you think you were helping her commit
She
suicide?
had talked about it.
But you shot her.
Yeah, I did.
He finally admitted that he shot Nina.
I think we've come so far today. Charlie, what do you think?
I feel like somebody took a big something off my shoulders.
Chuck Anderson had spent years lying about what he had done, but I felt for the first time vindicated. It was actually the 30th anniversary of my mom's murder. The DA's office said that they had enough to go forward with an arrest warrant, and I never thought I'd see that. I remember the detectives called me to let me know that right now, as we are speaking, they're placing the handcuffs on Charles Anderson for the murder of my mother. I could hear the sound of the cuffs clicking, and I cannot tell you how elated that made me. He didn't get away with it. And that was the most beautiful thing. After all those years, it was actually going to make it to court. We went into court, and Chuck actually had 3 lawyers that went into court with him. I knew that he would fight to get it dismissed, and I just want him to spend some time in jail.
It was almost like this was the last shot at a successful conclusion. But I knew we had evidence that he couldn't run away from. Justice needed to be served regardless of the time that had gone by.
I'm feeling that this is really gonna go somewhere, and the next day the whole bottom drops out. I got a call from the district attorney's office saying that they were going to offer him a plea bargain. They charged him with second-degree murder, and they were going to allow him to plea bargain to manslaughter. The laws applicable in '73 were not the same as in 2003. So they had to use the laws that were applicable in 1973, which gave a lot more good time credit. They were less restrictive into sentencing. And they were telling me that they were going to offer him a 1-year sentence.
Because the case was now decades old to the district attorney's office. They didn't have what you need to get a good, strong, long sentence. Then they just end up settling for what you can get.
There was a possibility that it would be thrown out of court and we would have never been able to take it back. So I had to be thankful for what I got. It sickened me, but it's what we had. I think in the end, I wanted him to say he was guilty. I wanted him, for the first time in his life, to own that he killed my mom in an open courtroom, to the judge and me in the courtroom. August 14th was my mom's birthday. The next day, we went in the courtroom for his sentencing, where Chuck was supposed to say, guilty, in order to get the 1-year sentence. But he stood there and he said, nolo contendere. I couldn't believe it. Nolo contendere means no contest. And everybody in the courtroom gasped. The judge said, I'm going to take that plea as a guilty plea based on the agreement that you reached with the district attorney's office. But it was just insulting. With time served while we were waiting to go to court, by the time they actually got him down to 4 Mile Correctional Facility, he only spent 5 weeks imprisoned. After Chuck got out of prison, the people in his hometown didn't want him around. He had difficulties finding people that accepted him. And a few years ago, he died. And it was a relief to know that Chuck's no longer on the streets and he can no longer hurt anybody.
Quite frankly, you presenting your evidence to them the way you did was a key component. You were the driver all that time. You're a hell of an investigator.
Thank you.
You're a hell of an investigator.
You were my ally.
I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you.
I dislike the word closure because there's so many open wounds. There's answers. There's time that passes that helps make things a little easier. But there's no closure. There's still the gaping hole of missing the person that you loved. It never changes. It doesn't go away. I'm glad that I got done what I got done. It's huge, really. It's monumental. I had the truth on my side. I had my mom on my side. I felt she was there, and I got to say what she couldn't say. It was the gift that I could give her. And I believe that she watched it all. And I know she's proud of me, which makes the 10-year-old Lisa happy to know Mom's proud. When the coroner signed the death certificate, I'm thinking, all right, they'll reopen the investigation, it'll go to trial, and then I'll have justice, and there'll be justice for my mother. Absolutely, I thought that they would see what the coroner saw, but they didn't. When I spoke to the sheriff's investigator, he told me that he had interviewed Chuck Anderson recently and that he believed Chuck's explanation in the original police report. And he told me the case was going to be open but inactive until there's new evidence. He wasn't going to work the file anymore. Another brick wall. I couldn't come in and do it for them, but I could get some more answers on my end. I continued to talk to people. I was up near Horse.
Tango to extinguish cigarette smoke. Suddenly I miss you and my heart aches. He searched for folk songs. Warsaw, Warsaw. Sending you red roses. Sending you my kisses and my nostalgia for home.
Into a garbage pit next to his pig pen. Eventually, I told Chuck I wanted something of my mother's. Anything. And so we went back to his house.
Must have been chilling, right?
It was chilling. But I know he's not gonna kill me. I'm too friggin' mean. We sat down and he opened his little file drawer and pulled out the deed to Mom's land. He held on to it like a frickin' trophy. Of course, it had been sold in probate, you know, no value other than that was a piece of paper that was in her purse, and I got it back. And he didn't get to keep the trophy. After seeing the deed to the land, I started questioning if Chuck's motive was a monetary value. I don't know, maybe he wanted to try and get her livestock, her land, and it was all about the money. They weren't together for love, that's for sure. Several people had made mention that Chuck wanted to take a life insurance policy out on her, which started a big fight in the bar, because he wanted to be the beneficiary, and Mom wanted Paula and I to be the beneficiary. They were only married 9 days. So she really got uncomfortable and really regretted marrying him and really wanted out and wanted him to go away, but he would not go. I had Chuck Anderson's motive, but it felt like it didn't matter. We can never hit the DA if the police don't do their portion. That's it. It's as far as we go. I'm questioning, will we ever see whatever justice is? Chuck Anderson took everything from me and took everything from my sister Paula. All the things that Paula endured in her years of placement and my mom's death, it even went as far as Paula committing suicide. She was a very troubled person and saw no other way out. I will always think Chuck's responsible for that. In 2001, I was working for a gun scope company, and somebody made mention that they had seen an article written about my mom's death. And in it, they too alluded to suicide. And that was one of my biggest peeves. So I called the Longmont Daily Times and I asked for them to do a retraction. And I waited 7 months before I just had it. And I went into the Longmont Daily Times and I ran into Dee Dee Corral.
There are certain details that I do remember very well.
Right.
Like you storming into the paper, wanting to...
For me, it was, I'm dialing direct.
It's not uncommon for a newspaper to get people coming in who are unhappy with something, and sometimes there is not much to their claims. And in this case, Lisa was fired up, but she also had all the documentation to support her grievance that the word suicide had been used.
I don't mind you doing an article on my mom, just make it factual.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I die, somebody's gonna look at this and say, it was suicide.
I would feel the same way. I went through all the reports and corrected some mistakes made in the coverage. And actually, in looking back at my notes, I noticed there were a number of contradictions in Charles Anderson's statements against what I knew was in the police reports. The story would not be complete without his version. We had to make the effort to try to talk to him.
I remember you were gonna go up there. I said, don't go out there alone.
I didn't have anyone available at the paper that day to go with me, so I got my dad to go with me. When I arrived, we had some concerns about Mr. Anderson. He had stickers on the outside of his door, making sure that everyone knew that he had weapons inside, but we had to make the effort. Mr. Anderson was drinking a beer and watching a show on TV. I think it was The Golden Girls. He invited me in, he was friendly, and he seemed willing to talk. And so I started off by asking him just some questions about the case. Immediately, he began to say things that contradicted what was in the police reports. And finally, at some point, just said, what happened? How did she die? How did she get shot? And that was where he looked up, he looked at me, and he said, well, she didn't shoot herself.